The roar of the ship's engines was deafening as it tore through the thick clouds. Ryan, a human soldier, gripped the seat tightly as the ship veered uncontrollably. The warning lights on the console flashed wildly. Red, yellow. Then, everything went dark. For what felt like hours, Ryan was lost in the darkness. His body ached, and his head throbbed with pain. His vision slowly returned, blurry at first, then more focused. The ship was falling. No, it had already fallen. The wreckage was all around him, pieces of metal and smoke drifting in the thick, humid air. Ryan's breathing was heavy, his hands shaking as he tried to unbuckle himself. His entire body was sore, but his legs felt worse. He tried to stand, but his left leg buckled under him. Pain shot through his thigh. He cursed under his breath. Not now, he thought, gritting his teeth. He pulled himself up, using the seat's frame as support. His breath came out in pained gasps, but there was no time to stop. He needed to get out of the wreckage. Ryan looked around, spotting a hole in the side of the ship. The outside world seemed alien, too bright, too loud. He stumbled toward the opening, dragging his injured leg behind him. When he finally crawled out of the ship, the heat hit him. The sun was too bright. The air smelled strange, thick with the scent of plant life, and something he couldn't quite place. He squinted against the harsh light, trying to steady himself. The planet's surface was covered in dense jungle, thick trees and vines wrapping around the remains of the ship. A low growl broke his focus. His heart skipped a beat. Ryan turned his head sharply. In the distance, shadows moved between the trees. Something was out there, and it didn't sound friendly. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Survival first, he thought. Everything else can wait. His body screamed at him to stop, but he pushed through the pain. He limped to the side of the ship, looking for anything he could use. There was an emergency pack, but it was buried under debris. He dug through the wreckage with his hands, pulling out what he could find: a first aid kit, a flare gun, and a small knife. As Ryan adjusted the pack on his back, he noticed something in the distance, something that shouldn't be there. A figure. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light. But no, it was real. A girl. She lay motionless among the twisted wreckage of the ship. She was covered in dirt and blood, her clothes torn. Her skin was a soft blue-gray, like the shade of a storm cloud, and her hair was dark, almost black, and tangled with vines. Her eyes were closed, and her body seemed still. She looked lifeless. Ryan's heart raced. Was she dead, or was she just unconscious? It didn't matter. He couldn't leave her like this. He limped over, his heart pounding with every step, and knelt beside her. His fingers found a pulse, weak but there. He sighed in relief. She was alive. Carefully, he checked her injuries. She had a deep gash along her side, where a piece of the ship had pierced her body. Blood oozed from the wound, staining her clothes and skin. It was bad, very bad. He wasn't sure if she would make it, but he had to try. Ryan grabbed the first aid kit and pulled out a bandage. With his hand shaking, he pressed it against her side, doing his best to stop the bleeding. She groaned softly, her eyes fluttering open. The first thing Ryan noticed was the fear in her eyes. She stared up at him, her face pale and confused. The alien girl tried to speak, but only a weak, raspy sound came out. She tried to move, but Ryan gently held her still. Hey, Ryan whispered, trying to calm her. You're gonna be okay. Just stay still. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, Ryan thought she might panic. She didn't know who he was, or where she was. She probably didn't even know if he was friend or foe. But she didn't scream. Instead, she gazed at him, studying him with suspicion. She spoke again, but it was in a language Ryan didn't understand. He shook his head. Sorry, I don't understand, Ryan said, his voice calm but firm. He knew this was no time to panic. The alien girl's gaze softened slightly, but she still looked terrified. She tried to speak again, her voice weak, but the words came out garbled. Ryan couldn't make sense of them, but he could tell she was trying to ask something. "Don't worry," Ryan muttered. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm just trying to help." Ryan knew they had little time. He couldn't stay here. There were creatures out there, and they'd be drawn to the ship's wreckage. He needed to get them both somewhere safe. "Can you stand?" he asked, gently lifting her into a sitting position. The girl's eyes flickered with pain, but she didn't scream. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. She gasped in pain, and Ryan quickly caught her, his injured leg almost giving out from the effort. "Easy," Ryan said softly. "I've got you." Ryan could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He was injured, she was injured, and they were stranded on a dangerous planet. There was no time to waste. He had to get her to safety, and fast. With the alien girl in his arms, Ryan started to move, stepping carefully over the wreckage. The creatures were still lurking somewhere in the jungle, but he couldn't worry about them now. He had a life to save. A desperate situation. Ryan's legs burned with every step, but he kept going. The alien girl, Zara, was weak in his arms, her body limp and trembling from pain. The jungle around them was dense, and every sound seemed to echo through the trees, making him feel more vulnerable. The emergency signal beacon was still too far away. He had to find shelter, somewhere safe, before nightfall. He couldn't let Zara stay exposed. There were creatures out there. He knew they'd be drawn to the wreckage, and now they were close to him too. His injured leg felt like it was about to give out, but he pushed on, refusing to stop. Zara was barely conscious, her breathing shallow, and her eyes flickered open every now and then. When she did, she stared up at him, confusion and fear still in her gaze. Ryan felt a strange pull in his chest. He didn't know this girl, didn't even understand her language, but something told him he had to protect her. He had no idea who she was, but the look in her eyes made him want to do everything in his power to keep her safe. He finally spotted a small cave, hidden behind thick vines and bushes. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Carefully, he carried Zara inside, placing her down gently on the ground. She winced as her body made contact with the cold, hard floor of the cave, but she didn't scream. Ryan quickly pulled out the first aid kit from his pack and examined her injuries again. The deep gash on her side was still bleeding, but the bandage he put on earlier was holding for now. "Stay with me, okay?" Ryan said softly, his voice low and reassuring. Zara's eyes flickered open, but she didn't respond. Ryan didn't have time to waste. He pulled out a small flashlight and looked around the cave. The walls were rough, but there was a small pool of water in the corner. It wasn't much, but it could be useful. He had to keep Zara hydrated and try to stop the bleeding before it got worse. He wiped his sweaty brow, staring at her helplessly for a moment. "Come on, Ryan," he thought. "Think. What would you do in a situation like this?" His mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. He knew they needed more supplies, but there was nothing nearby except for the wreckage and the dangerous jungle beyond. Suddenly, a noise broke his focus, a loud rustling from the jungle outside. Ryan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He held his breath, hoping the sound was just an animal passing by. Then came the growl. Ryan's eyes widened. That was no animal. That was something far worse. He slowly turned his head to Zara, who was now looking at him with wide, fearful eyes. He knew they were in danger. This wasn't just a random animal. This was something dangerous, hunting them. "Stay quiet," Ryan whispered, his voice sharp with urgency. Zara nodded, her breath coming faster as she tried to sit up, but Ryan quickly stopped her. "No," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You need to rest. I'll take care of this." Ryan's heart pounded as he crept to the mouth of the cave, trying to stay hidden in the shadows. His eyes scanned the thick jungle beyond, but he couldn't see much. The creatures were getting closer, though. He could hear them. Large, heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush. His pulse quickened as the sounds grew louder, and he realized there were more than one. They were closing in on the cave, attracted by the wreckage. Ryan clenched his fists, trying to calm himself. He didn't have time to be afraid. He needed to keep Zara safe. He checked his gear. His knife was still there, and his flare gun. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He stepped closer to the entrance, careful to make as little noise as possible. Suddenly, a shadow appeared at the edge of the jungle. Ryan's eyes narrowed. It was big, much bigger than any animal he'd seen before. His stomach dropped. The creature was covered in thick, scaly armor and had large, glowing eyes that looked straight at him. It growled again, a deep, menacing sound that made Ryan's blood run cold. The creature stepped closer to the cave, sniffing the air as if it could sense their presence. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. What now? His grip tightened around the knife. He had to do something, anything, to keep Zara safe. Without thinking, Ryan grabbed the flare gun from his belt and aimed it at the creature. The glowing flare shot into the sky with a loud pop, lighting up the dark jungle. The creature roared, confused and startled by the sudden light. Ryan didn't wait to see what happened next. He quickly turned and ran back into the cave, where Zara was watching him with wide eyes. "We need to move," Ryan said urgently, his voice low. "Now." Zara stared at him, her face pale and full of fear. She didn't say anything but nodded weakly, her body still trembling. She knew they couldn't stay here much longer. The creature outside was just the beginning. There were more out there, and they were closing in. Ryan quickly grabbed her, lifting her into his arms once again. His leg protested, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. They had to get out of the cave, away from the creatures that were now circling. Together, they stumbled through the jungle, moving as fast as they could, Ryan's heart pounding in his chest. Every noise in the jungle felt like it was a predator, hunting them. But no matter how much his body ached, he didn't stop. Zara's life was in his hands now, and he wouldn't fail her. The journey begins. Ryan's body ached, and his heart was racing. The jungle was dark, the trees thick with vines that twisted like snakes. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he couldn't stop. Zara's life depended on him. She was still weak in his arms, her body trembling with pain, but her eyes were open now, quiet, fearful, and trying to understand what was happening. Every noise around them made Ryan jump. The jungle was alive with sounds, birds calling in the distance, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional growl of something far too big for comfort. But the worst part was the silence that came between the noises. That's when Ryan knew something was watching them. He could feel it. He glanced down at Zara, her face pale, her breathing shallow. She needed help, and he didn't have the medical supplies to fix everything. He had a small amount of water, some food rations, and a few medical kits, but it wasn't enough. They were stranded on a hostile planet, and Ryan had no idea how long it would take to get to safety. "We have to keep moving," Ryan muttered to himself, but the words didn't make him feel any better. His mind was a mess of worry and fear. Zara had been hurt badly, and their chances of survival were growing slimmer by the minute. He didn't have a plan. He didn't know where to go. But he knew one thing. He had to protect her. Zara stirred in his arms, her eyes flickering open as she let out a soft groan. Ryan slowed his pace, trying to keep her comfortable, but there was no time to stop. He couldn't afford to rest. Every moment wasted could bring more danger. "Stay with me," Ryan whispered, his voice rough. "We'll get through this." Zara's eyes met his for a brief moment, and she nodded weakly. She was still confused, still in pain, but her trust in him was clear. She didn't know him, but in this moment, he was her only chance. Ryan tightened his grip on her and pushed forward. The jungle seemed endless, stretching out in every direction with no clear path. There was no sign of civilization, No sign of rescue. All he could see were dense trees and thick brush. The sun was barely visible through the thick canopy, making it hard to judge the time. They passed what seemed like hours, the only sound being their footsteps and the occasional cry of distant animals. Zara's weight felt heavier with every step, but Ryan refused to stop. He couldn't show weakness, not when her life was in its hands. Finally, they came to a small clearing. Ryan stopped for a moment, breathing heavily as he looked around. The clearing was small, with tall grass growing around the edges. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the ground. Ryan knew they couldn't stay out in the open for long. Night was when the real dangers would come. The creatures that hunted in the dark would be looking for prey, and he didn't want to be anyone's dinner. He knelt down, carefully placing Zara on the ground. She looked up at him with wide eyes, her lips parted as if trying to speak, but no words came out. Ryan knew she couldn't talk. She was too weak. He reached into his bag and pulled out some of the remaining water, offering it to her. She drank slowly, her hands trembling as she gripped the bottle. Ryan took the chance to check his map again. It was a long shot, but he hoped it would show him a way to reach the emergency signal beacon. It was their only hope. He studied the map in the dim light. It didn't look good. The beacon was far away, and there was no clear path. He couldn't tell if they were even going in the right direction. But he had no choice. The jungle was their only option. "We have to keep going, Zara," Ryan said softly, meeting her gaze. "We'll make it. We just have to keep moving." Zara blinked slowly, but she didn't say anything. Ryan helped her to her feet again, carefully supporting her as they began to walk. The ground was uneven, and Ryan had to watch every step, not just for himself, but for Zara too. She was still weak and unable to walk on her own, but she seemed to be trying. He noticed her trying to take small steps beside him, but her legs were unsteady. "Don't push yourself," Ryan said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'll carry you if I have to." Zara shook her head, her expression hardening in defiance. She didn't want to be a burden. Ryan couldn't help but smile at her determination, even though he knew it would only slow them down. They continued on, the sun dipping lower behind the trees. The jungle was growing darker by the minute, and Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. The creatures he'd heard earlier were still out there. He could feel their presence, watching and waiting. Suddenly, a sound broke through the air, a rustling from the trees ahead. Ryan stopped dead in his tracks, his heart racing as his eyes darted around. He saw nothing, but the sound was getting closer. Something was moving toward them. Zara clung to his side, her body stiff with fear. Ryan felt his own body tense, ready for whatever was coming. He knew they couldn't outrun whatever was out there. Then the noise stopped. Ryan held his breath, listening carefully. The silence stretched out, and for a moment he thought maybe the danger had passed. But then, in the distance, he heard it again, a growl, low and menacing. Ryan cursed under his breath. They weren't alone. "We need to find shelter," Ryan muttered urgently. Zara looked up at him, her face pale with fear. He didn't want to frighten her more, but he had to be honest. "There's something out there, and we need to get out of sight." With that, Ryan grabbed Zora's hand and pulled her toward the trees, hoping they could hide before the creatures found them. Close calls. Ryan's breath came in short, sharp bursts as he and Zora moved deeper into the jungle. Every step felt like they were running from something, though there was nothing to see. The underbrush made noise underfoot, and the dense trees closed in around them like a thick wall. He could feel the pressure of the dark jungle closing in on them. The sounds of distant creatures were unsettling, but there was something else, something he couldn't shake. It was the feeling that they were being hunted. Zara's footsteps were slow and unsteady, and Ryan had to keep an arm around her waist, supporting her weight as they walked. The gash on her side was still bleeding, and she was pale, so pale that Ryan could see her bones beneath her skin. It hurt to see her like this, But there was no time to stop, no time to rest. Ahead of them, the trees thinned out a bit, and Ryan's heart skipped. Maybe this was the chance he needed to find shelter or a safe spot to think. But when he stopped, looking ahead, he realized the danger was closer than he thought. A large shape moved between the trees. Ryan froze. His mind raced. It was big, too big to be an animal they could easily outrun. It was slow, lumbering, but Ryan could feel its eyes on him. He quickly grabbed Zora's arm and pulled her down, ducking behind a large fallen tree. Zora gasped, but Ryan put a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. He could hear the creature breathing, deep and heavy, like the sound of something large sniffing the air. Zora's hand tightened on his, her body stiff with fear. Ryan's heart beat louder than the creature's growl, but he didn't dare move. The creature was too close. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. The jungle grew silent again. Ryan slowly peeked around the tree, holding his breath. The creature had passed by, moving away from them. He could see its silhouette through the branches, a hulking four-legged beast with eyes glowing in the dark. It was massive, easily the size of a small house. Ryan's stomach dropped. That was too close. He waited for a few more minutes, making sure the creature didn't turn back. When he was sure it was gone, he helped Zora to her feet, moving as quietly as he could. "We have to keep moving," Ryan whispered, but his voice sounded louder than he wanted. "That thing is still out there." Zora nodded, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion. She didn't speak, but Ryan could feel the weight of her trust in him. She didn't know what kind of creature that was, but she could feel the danger too. Ryan glanced around. The jungle wasn't just silent, it was watching them. It felt like everything had stopped, like the creatures that roamed the land were waiting for them to make the wrong move. The thought of running into that beast again was enough to make Ryan's legs ache with tension. They moved again, this time staying low and quiet. Ryan kept his eyes scanning the trees, the ground, the shadows around them. Every sound made him flinch. The wind rustled the leaves, and something moved in the bushes, but he didn't stop. There was no time to hesitate. But then, another noise. It was soft at first, a crack of branches snapping under weight. Ryan held his breath. He was sure the creature was back. His mind raced, thinking of what he could do to get them out of there. The jungle was too thick for a quick escape, and running wasn't an option. They couldn't outrun it, and they couldn't fight it either. Ryan reached for his knife, the only weapon he had. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "Stay close," Ryan whispered to Zora, his voice barely audible. They took another few steps, moving as quietly as possible, but the noise got louder. The creature was closer. He could hear its breathing again, heavy and strained, and the ground beneath him seemed to vibrate with its steps. Ryan's heart raced. He turned quickly, pulling Zora behind him as they ducked into another small gap between the trees, hiding in a thick bush. Seconds felt like minutes, but nothing moved. The jungle fell silent again. Ryan's muscles ached with tension, and Zora's grip on his arm was tight, almost painful. He couldn't tell if she was more afraid of the creature or of his quick, desperate movements. Then, without warning, the sound came again. This time, it was closer, too close. The creature was right in front of them. Ryan's pulse surged in his ears. He could hear the creature sniffing the air, its massive paws shifting on the ground. He held his breath, willing Zora to stay quiet, to not make a sound. The beast's glowing eyes scanned the bushes, moving slowly, searching for them. Ryan's throat was dry, and his hands were slick with sweat. His heart felt like it was beating in his throat. He couldn't move. He couldn't make a noise. If they were discovered, they were dead. For what felt like an eternity, the creature loomed over them. Then, finally, the animal moved away, stepping through the trees with a slow, careful pace. Ryan didn't dare exhale until it was gone. He slowly turned to Zora, his heart still hammering. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "That was too close," Ryan said, his voice hoarse. "We have to keep going. We can't stay here." Zora didn't speak, but she nodded weakly. She was still scared, still shaking, but they couldn't afford to stay in one place any longer. The longer they waited, the higher the chance that the creature, or worse, would find them. Ryan helped her to her feet again. There was no time to waste. They had to keep moving, no matter how close the dangers got. Unexpected survival skills. Ryan didn't know how long they had been walking. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, and the jungle had become darker, more oppressive. Each step felt heavier, as though the weight of the jungle itself was pulling them down. Zara was still leaning on him, her steps slow and shaky. She wasn't speaking much anymore, and her grip on his arm had loosened. It was hard to tell whether she was still awake or drifting in and out of consciousness. But Ryan couldn't afford to stop. Not now. They had to keep moving. The night was coming quickly. In this jungle, night wasn't just dark, it was dangerous. That terrifying creature they had almost crossed paths with earlier could be out there. And there were other dangers that Ryan could only imagine. He had to find a way to keep Zara alive, even though his own strength was fading. As he moved forward, trying to ignore the ache in his body, something caught his eye. A small stream running through the jungle, its waters sparkling even in the dim light. It wasn't much, but it was something. Water. "Look, Zara, water," Ryan whispered, trying to make her focus. Her head lifted slightly, but her eyes were cloudy, and she didn't respond. Ryan didn't hesitate. He quickly knelt by the stream and cupped his hands to drink. The cool water was a relief, refreshing and sweet. He drank quickly, but not too much, knowing he had to ration it. He needed to stay sharp. He glanced at Zara, who still didn't seem to notice the stream. Her eyes were half closed, and her breathing was shallow. Ryan frowned, but then something caught his ear. Soft, scraping sounds from behind him. His senses went on high alert, and his body tensed. The jungle was never quiet. Ryan turned just in time to see a large, thick vine swinging toward him. Before he could react, the vine wrapped around his arm, pulling him off his feet and dragging him toward a tree. Ryan struggled, trying to free himself, but the vine was strong, merely pulling him off the ground. Panic surged through him as the vine tightened, but then a memory flashed in his mind. The training he had received back at the academy. He had learned survival skills, how to use the environment to his advantage, how to react when faced with traps or threats. Ryan drew on that training, instinctively reaching for his knife. The blade caught the vine and sliced through it. The moment it snapped, he tumbled to the ground, landing hard on his back. For a moment, he just lay there, panting, trying to catch his breath. His heart pounded in his chest, and his body throbbed with pain. But the danger wasn't over. He had to keep moving. "Zara, we need to go," Ryan said through gritted teeth. With great effort, he rose to his feet. The knife was still in his hand, and his mind was sharp despite the exhaustion. The vine, he realized, was a part of a larger trap, one designed to pull prey toward the tree and keep them there. But Ryan had survived. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it wouldn't be the last. He quickly moved back to Zara, kneeling beside her. The girl was barely able to keep her eyes open, but Ryan had no time to wait for her to recover. He scooped her up, holding her in his arms as he moved away from the dangerous vine and toward the safety of the stream. It wasn't much, but it was a break, a place where he could think and make plans. "I need to keep you safe," Ryan muttered to her. "We can't stay out here." As he crossed the stream with Zora in his arms, he began to search the area. The sound of the water hid other noises, and Ryan was careful not to alert anything that might be watching them. The jungle was still a dangerous place, but there was a chance he could find shelter nearby. It didn't take long before he spotted a small cave hidden behind a cluster of thick bushes. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Ryan hurried to it, stepping carefully over rocks and roots. When he reached the entrance, he gently laid Zora down on the ground. Ryan took a deep breath. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to rest. The adrenaline was still pumping through his veins, but he knew they needed to sleep. The night would only get worse if they didn't take advantage of this brief moment of safety. Zora was out cold, and Ryan had to make sure she was comfortable, at least as much as possible. He looked around the cave, finding a few dried leaves and some small branches. Using his knife, he cut them into smaller pieces and laid them down as a makeshift bed for Zora. Once she was resting as best she could, Ryan moved outside the cave, scanning the area for any sign of danger. His senses were on high alert, and his hands gripped his knife tightly. The last thing he wanted was to be surprised by something while Zora was vulnerable inside. The jungle was full of hidden threats, but Ryan had learned how to survive in places like this. He had experience in tracking, in reading the signs of the land. There were many dangers out there, but there were also opportunities. The jungle could be a friend if you knew how to use it. Ryan knelt by the cave's entrance, his eyes scanning the trees and underbrush. His mind was calculating, constantly thinking of ways to stay one step ahead. The vine had almost caught him, but he had outsmarted it. He'd used his training, and he would keep doing the same. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about protecting Zora, keeping her alive long enough to escape this nightmare. Ryan didn't know how long it would take, but he was prepared. The jungle had its dangers, but he had his skills. And with those skills, he would survive. Rescue and revelation. The morning was colder than Ryan had expected. The dense jungle had a chill that seeped into his bones, but it wasn't the cold he feared. It was the silence. The silence that followed the chaos of the previous night. Zora was still asleep, her shallow breathing the only sign of life in the cave. Ryan, however, could not rest. His mind was racing with thoughts of what to do next. The last few days had been a blur of survival, but the one thing that weighed on his mind was the truth he had yet to uncover. Zora was no ordinary girl. Ryan had known that from the moment he found her. Her injuries weren't just from a crash. They were from something more, something deeper. She had said little, but the flashes of fear in her eyes told Ryan that she was hiding something. And there was one more thing that bothered him. Her strange markings, the tattoos that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, the way she had reacted when she thought he was going to kill her. There was something in her past that made her afraid of humans. It was more than just survival instincts. As Ryan sat on the cave's edge, staring into the dense jungle, a soft rustling broke the stillness. He tensed, reaching for his knife, his senses sharp. The noise wasn't from an animal. It was too careful, too deliberate. Someone, or something, was out there. He stood quickly, his heart pounding. He moved toward Zora, checking that she was still asleep. The jungle was dangerous, but not nearly as dangerous as the things that might be tracking them. Ryan crept out of the cave, keeping low to the ground. The rustling came closer. He waited, holding his breath, as the noise grew louder, until he could finally make out the figures emerging from the trees. 2 men. They were wearing the dark green uniforms of a military unit. Ryan's heart skipped a beat as they stepped into the clearing, their weapons at the ready. They were armed. He didn't have much time. He had no choice but to act. With a low growl, Ryan sprinted toward them, his muscles coiling in preparation. Before the men could react, he was on them, taking one down with a swift strike to the throat. The other man swung around, aiming his rifle at Ryan, but Ryan was already on him, twisting his arm and knocking the weapon out of his hands. The soldier fell to the ground with a grunt, but Ryan didn't stop there. He grabbed the man by the collar and slammed him against a tree, his eyes burning with intensity. "Who are you?" Ryan demanded, his voice cold. The soldier's eyes were wide with fear, but he said nothing. Ryan's grip tightened. "Tell me what you're doing here. Why are you after her?" The soldier hesitated, his lips trembling. But then something shifted in his expression, A flicker of recognition. You're the one who crashed the ship, the soldier muttered. His voice was trembling now. We've been tracking you. Ryan's mind raced. He had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed was still a shock. These men were not here to help. They were part of the group who had sent Zara's ship crashing down in the first place. They had been hunting her. Zara, Ryan whispered, his heart pounding. What did they want with her? The soldier didn't answer. His face was pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. Ryan could see the fear in his eyes, and he knew that the soldier was not lying. But he still needed answers. He pushed the man harder, his patience wearing thin. She's not human, the soldier said, his voice shaking. She's a hybrid, part alien, part human. They wanted to study her, use her as a weapon. Ryan's heart sank. He knew there was something about Zara that wasn't right, but hearing it out loud made it real. She wasn't just a victim. She was something far more important, something that they wanted to control. The soldier's words echoed in Ryan's mind. Zara was part alien. No wonder she had been so afraid. No wonder she had reacted the way she did when Ryan tried to help her. She wasn't just running from the crash. She was running from the people who wanted to experiment on her, use her as a weapon. Ryan felt a surge of anger, but he pushed it down. He had to focus. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment now. He released the soldier, letting him fall to the ground. Stay down, Ryan warned. If you move, I'll end you. Ryan turned and sprinted back toward the cave, his mind racing. What did all of this mean for Zara? How had she ended up in this situation? And what was her real purpose? As he entered the cave, Zara was still lying there, unaware of the danger that had almost found them. She had been unconscious for too long, and Ryan feared that she wouldn't survive much longer if he didn't act quickly. But now he had a decision to make. Should he leave with her, take her somewhere safe and away from the military that was hunting her? Or should he try to learn more about who she was and why they wanted her so badly? Ryan crouched beside her, looking at her face. He could see the fear, the pain, but there was something else there too. Something strong, something defiant. Zara was no victim. She had survived this long for a reason. And now it was his turn to help her. He would get the answers he needed, and he would protect her, no matter the cost. A new beginning. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft orange glow over the jungle. The night had been quiet, almost too quiet, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Ryan sat by the small fire he had built, watching the smoke curl up into the sky. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and burning wood. But it was peaceful. For the first time in days, there was no immediate danger. Zara was awake now, sitting near him. She still looked tired, her face pale and drawn from days of struggle, but there was something different in her eyes. It wasn't the fear that had once dominated her gaze. It was something stronger, something that told Ryan she had made a choice, one that had not been easy, but one that was hers to make. Ryan glanced at her, noticing how the marks on her skin glowed faintly in the morning light. They were still a mystery to him, but the fear that had once accompanied them was gone. Instead, there was a quiet strength in her, something Ryan hadn't fully understood until now. "How are you feeling?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. Zara nodded slowly, her eyes meeting his. "Better," she said, her voice soft but steady. I remember what happened now. I know who I am." Ryan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, looking out over the jungle as if gathering her thoughts. "I wasn't supposed to be here. The crash wasn't an accident. It was a plan." She paused, her gaze distant. "They sent me to Earth on purpose. I'm not just some victim, Ryan. I was meant to be a weapon." Ryan frowned, his mind racing. "A weapon?" Zara nodded. "I'm part of a program, a project, to combine alien technology with human genetics. The military wanted to create soldiers, people who could survive anything, do anything." She shook her head, as if the idea itself was too much to bear. But it was never about helping people. It was about control. They wanted me to be a weapon. And now they're hunting me. They'll never stop until they have me. Ryan stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. The rage inside him grew. The thought of anyone using Zora like that made his blood boil. They can't do that. They won't. Not while I'm here. Zora looked up at him, her expression softening. I never asked for this, Ryan. But now I have to choose. I can't keep running from who I am. I have to stop them. I have to make sure they never hurt anyone again. Ryan's heart sank. He understood now. Zora wasn't just fighting for her life anymore. She was fighting for the lives of others, for a future where she wasn't just some weapon to be used. He admired her strength. Then we'll fight together, Ryan said, his voice firm. Zora gave a small smile. Thank you. I never thought I would find someone like you out here. Ryan knelt in front of her, looking her in the eyes. You don't have to do this alone anymore. For a moment, they just sat in silence, the weight of their shared understanding hanging between them. Then Zora stood up, brushing the dirt off her clothes. I've been running long enough, she said. I've learned what I need to know. Now it's time to take control. And I can't do it without you. Ryan stood with her. We'll need a plan. We can't just confront them without knowing what we're up against. Zora nodded. I know a place. There's a hidden base where they keep their data, where they store information on the program I was part of. If we can get there, we can destroy it. We can stop them from making more soldiers like me. Ryan's eyes hardened with determination. Then that's where we'll go. We'll take down the program. Together. The thought of fighting back, of standing up against the force that had put Zora through so much pain, filled him with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. He had been a soldier, yes, but now he was fighting for something far more important. He was fighting for her, for their future. As the morning light grew stronger, they packed what little gear they had left. The jungle around them was still dangerous, but for the first time, Ryan didn't feel so alone. With Zora by his side, he felt like there was nothing they couldn't face. They didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. They had each other now. The journey ahead would be long, and it would be hard, but they would face it together. They would take on the military, destroy the program that created Zora, and build a future where she wasn't just a weapon. As they walked through the jungle, their steps in sync, Ryan glanced at Zora once more. She was no longer the scared girl he had found in the wreckage. She was strong, determined, and ready to fight for her freedom. And Ryan, he was ready to fight for her. This was only the beginning.